Ladies and gentlemen and brethren, good evening. We are live across the UK. Indeed, we are live across the world. And welcome to Solomon Live. My name is Brodie. I have the honour of being the Provincial Communications Officer for the distinguished province of Worcestershire and also the host of these monthly webinars. Now, I must say, if you do have any questions this evening, please submit them via our question and answer facility at the bottom of your screen. And without any further ado, our Solomon Live this evening is Masonry Universal. And joining us this evening, Grand Chancellor, very worshipful brother, Lieutenant Commander Paul Engeham, UGLE's Foreign Secretary. Paul, good evening and welcome to Solomon Live. How are you?
Good evening, brethren. It's very alarming when somebody says you're going to tell lots of nice anecdotes. In the Royal Navy, we call those dits, and I'm always accused of telling far too many of them. I'm actually speaking to you from my flat in Fitzroy Square, near the centre of London. I've just been for a quick walk around Regent's Park, and I have a refreshing stein of beer here in a German mug to show my international credentials. So cheers to you all.
Well, what you've got there, Paul, is certainly more entertaining than what I've got here. And brethren, this is actual water. So, Paul, we've got to begin by going back to your early days in Freemasonry. When did you first become a Freemason?
Well, it is quite an anecdote in itself. While I was at university, I did actually meet some members of the University Lodge. And at the time, I thought they were a bit loony. I later found out they were. I was right about that. But anyway, immediately after that, I ended up walking around the garden of a prospective father-in-law, although he didn't actually quite say any prospective son-in-law of mine would do well to become a Freemason. That was the message I took away from it. And that led to my being proposed for initiation into the Middlesex Lodge 143, a lodge which incidentally I share with David Staples. Indeed, I proposed him into that lodge, his first London lodge. I digress. The point is that by the time I was there ready for initiation, I was at the Britannia Royal Naval College at Dartmouth. And for the first 2 months there, you don't get any leave. You don't escape. However, the captain got a very impressive letter on headed notepaper saying, could I be spared to go up to London for this? And I was allowed. And the only other person allowed was another chap in our class who rejoices in the name of His Royal Highness Prince Charles, Prince of Wales. And he was allowed to go up to a state banquet on the occasion of the Emperor Hirohito visiting Britain. And the difference was that he got flown back by a helicopter and I had to come back on the milk train. Anyway, I got initiated there. And of course, what happens then is that because you're serving in the Navy, you really can't get to very many meetings unless you visit. And the next lodge I joined was actually not for another 20 years or so, and it was in India, because I was very fortunate enough to be sent out as a representative of my proposer into Masonry to the Archibald Campbell Lodge, which is out in Chennai, in the district of Madras, and his father is the person after whom the lodge was named, and I joined that lodge, which is a fantastic experience to go because the members mostly are Hindu, but we have Muslims, Parsis, Jains, Christians, and Jews in the lodge as well. Incidentally, very complicated, all those volumes of sacred law, and you are organizing a dinner menu for Jains and lots of vegetarians. Anyway, I digress again. But what happens then is that you end up being asked, oh, you must join another lodge. Thank goodness we only meet 4 times a year, unlike most.
Oh, yes, we've all heard that one.
Indeed. And so that happened, and I eventually joined the Apollo University Lodge in Oxford, which is, I have to say, excellent. And most recently, I became a joining member of Lodge 10,000, Lodge Tino Nomine, I think probably because we're keen to export the experiences of that lodge, which brings lots of young people in and puts them in charge early on and emphasizes very good ritual. I think we want to export that idea to as many Grand Lodges as are interested. So that's I could go on at great length about that,
Well,
but that's where I got to where I am.
I think we've got a good idea how you started in Freemasonry, Paul, and already I've asked you one question. You've already come up with some great stories. So this is just a flavour of what we're going to hear in the next 40 minutes or so. So let's talk about your time in the Royal Navy. Where did that take you around the world?
I was what's called an executive officer, seaman officer, what they now call warfare officer, and the effect of that is that essentially I spent the first 20 years of my career at sea, apart from the odd course here and there. And of course, when you're dedicated in a ship, it's very difficult for you to get back to your mother lodge. In fact, I couldn't do it. I couldn't guarantee you to be at meetings. So I didn't take office actually for 20 years. During that time, I visited a wide range of countries, some of them places where you would expect there to be Freemasonry: Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Malaysia, but some perhaps less likely. Some places in the United States of America, and I expect we'll come on to that later, but also in for example, Chile, in South America. So, and indeed India. So that sea time was followed by a period when after that in my career, I spent some time working with the Foreign Office, and then joined the Ministry of Defence, and in a role that also involved quite a lot of international travel. So I have been able to take advantage of visiting lodges in many different climes over the years, and always often at short notice, of course, because one is not allowed to make contact with in a foreign country until one's actually in that country, which means you arrive at short notice. And yet, as a visiting naval officer, I was invariably welcomed most warmly and entertained and made to feel most welcome.
Oh, that's fantastic. And we need to talk about your role as Grand Chancellor, because you do sound the perfect fit for it, Paul, with your Masonic career, your military career as well. Let's talk about what that role involves to the uninitiated. Let's use that term.
And you say they're uninitiated because there may well be non-Masons on this call. And I should have said, when I said good evening, brethren, I should have said brethren and others, because maybe there are others listening in. And others makes me say immediately that I can only do what I do because I have a staff who work full-time at the Grand Lodge of England in support. So the Assistant Grand Chancellor, David Roberts-Jones, and Kerry Byas, probably known to many of you, are an invaluable support. They are as it were, the engine room of what we do. And then there are other members of the External Relations Committee as well, including a Deputy Grand Chancellor and an assistant who also both part-time and work from home. But you talk about the role, it hasn't actually existed for very long, because once upon a time, of course, there wasn't much Masonic intervisitation because the nature of the world didn't allow for that very much. So the job was subsumed within that of the Grand Secretary, and it was only split off. I can't know exactly how long ago, but about 20 years ago or so. And my predecessor as Grand Chancellor left me with a fantastic legacy to follow. So, I so frequently telephone them to say, what on earth do you do in this situation? And fortunately, they're around and they give always extremely sensible answers. So I'm very grateful for them for that.
Oh, that's good. That's good that it happens at all levels.
I think I should have explained, though, if I may go on, just to say that, why do we have international relations? Well, essentially, it boils down to the fact that we want to visit other lodges when we are overseas, and we like people from overseas visiting our lodges. But there are lots and lots of organizations outside there and across the other side of the Channel and across the Atlantic who call themselves Freemasonry, with whom nobody on this call would want anything to do whatsoever. And so part of my job is to maintain the relationships with the 224 Grand Lodges that we do recognize and that we do like, and warn people against the others. And of course, we have new Grand Lodges seeking to join us all the time.
Oh, that's brilliantly explained, Paul, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail a little bit later on. So there's lots of people joining us this evening, all over the country, all over the world, who know you very well, because you are a big, well-respected Freemason, an illustrious Freemason, and we've also got to understand the job a little bit more. But we need to just calm down just a little bit before we carry on. Let's just take a break and talk about Ukraine if we can, because this is something where Freemasonry is supporting, and you'll have strong views on this as well, Paul, from your military background as well.
And I need to tell all the brethren on the call that when I was first talking to Brodie about this earlier, I said, look, I want to talk about Ukraine straight away. How can you possibly talk about anything, let alone anything foreign, but anything at all, without talking about that ghastly situation that the people in that country face, both on the ground and leaving it as refugees? It dominates our thought and our news, and anybody with the slightest bit of empathy surely has that to the forefront of their mind. I perhaps have an even greater understanding than some others on this call, because I have been at war. I took part in the Falklands campaign in the flagship HMS Glamorgan, a ship that was hit. I was involved in dealing with the injured and dying in that ship, and I also had some experiences in Northern Ireland that were quite up close. So my empathy is perhaps stronger than some others. I think what's important is to remember there is a Grand Lodge of Ukraine, and there is a Grand Lodge of Russia. And in that Grand Lodge of Russia, they will have had the same ritual as we have, that nature hath implanted in your breast a sacred and indissoluble attachment to that country whence you derive your birth and infant nurture. But at the same time, they are driven by charity. This is a very good example of why, brethren, we never talk about politics and charity within our lodges. And if you go back and if you look, and I was talking about the job here, if you go back to the yearbook that we have here, this contains within it the basic principles for Grand Lodge recognition, but also it contains the aims and relationships of the craft. And in that aims and relationships of the craft, which was written just before the Second World War and confirmed just after the Second World War, it explains why we do not take action based upon politics that we do not like. We keep clear of that as far as we can. So this is a sensitive topic. For us, I think the highest priority now is charity, because that is something that we can do about. And I'm delighted to say that the Masonic Charitable Foundation, which is entirely separate in the way it takes its decisions, it is not at all fed by the Chancellery or by other bits of Masonry. It looks at need on the basis that institution has put out an appeal. And I don't know, do we have an update on how that appeal is doing, Brodie?
We do actually. When we last looked, Paul, I think it was something around £179,000, which is an incredible amount of money raised. And also, in just a moment, brethren, we'll do this anytime now. We'll add an MCF appeal link to the chat screen for you to click on and maybe make a donation as well. So that's the latest information there, Paul.
Thank you very much indeed. Look, this is the most important thing going on at the moment, and you can't talk about foreign relations without having this to the forefront. The weekend before last, I was lucky enough to be in Belgium at a meeting of the Grand Lodge of Belgium, and the Grand Masters present. That was to the forefront of our conversation, how we could possibly react to this. But going back to how we think about it within our lodges, remember, we must not do anything that might sow the seeds of discord and produce disharmony within our lodges. And that also has to be to the forefront of our minds. But thank you for allowing me to say that, Brodie.
No, no, no. It would have been remiss of us not to discuss that, Paul. So thank you very much indeed. And once again, brethren, we've added the link to the chat screen if you'd like to get an update and maybe make a contribution. And of course, our hearts and our prayers are thinking about everybody in Ukraine at the moment and those affected by the crisis. So, Paul, I wanted to talk to you about this. In the images we've used to promote Solomon Live, I noticed there was a picture of you with some penguins in the background. Now, I'm pretty sure that photograph wasn't taken at London Zoo. Perhaps you could tell me a little bit more about that photograph, if that's okay.
It can actually, yes. There's a connection actually between that photograph and the stash I'm wearing. Anybody with a good camera might be able to see that I've got here the badge of HMS Dragon, one of our Type 45 destroyers. And 3 years ago, I went down and spent Christmas in South Georgia. Now, South Georgia, brethren and others on this call, is a sub-Antarctic island down and to the right of the Falkland Islands. Many of you will know about it because you'll cast your mind back that on this date 40 years ago, pretty much, scrap metal merchants landed in South Georgia and set off the chain of events that led to the Falklands campaign. But it is relevant here because there's a Masonic connection, because it was in South Georgia that Worship Brother Ernest Shackleton unfortunately died, and his funeral was going to be on the shore, but he was actually taken back to South Georgia and buried there at the expense of the lodge of which he was at the time the master. There's another Masonic connection here. Shackleton's expedition, you will remember that he left men behind on Elephant Island. He himself went to South Georgia to raise the alarm and get help. But then there was the question of how to get to Elephant Island, and there were various attempts that failed. The attempt that eventually succeeded was members of a lodge in Punta Arenas in Chile who had a tug, and that tug was used, and that went down, and that was able to get through the ice to Elephant Island and to bring the men out from there. And the lodge in Punta Arenas still exists and remembers that. Wow. There's also a lodge down on the island of Ushuaia, down in southern Argentina, the most southerly lodge in the world, I think they would claim to be. And it is my intention, when next visiting the Falkland Islands as a veteran, to visit the monument that we built to our dead there. It's my intention to visit both of those lodges if I possibly can, but on a private basis, not necessarily in a formal way as Grand Chancellor. And the word Georgia then leads on to two other things, I'm afraid. There you are, you see, you can't shut me up. Because there are two other Georgias, aren't there? There's a state of Georgia, which is on the Black Sea. Well, let's look at that one first. For many, many years, there was no Freemasonry in Georgia because it was in the Soviet Union where that wasn't practicable. But eventually they started to get going. But the problem is that several other foreign Grand Lodges started lodges there. And it was some time before a Grand Lodge started to form. And then it all gets complicated. I'm not going to go into that now. Suffice it to say, the Grand Lodge of England has a policy that we do not recognise any new Grand Lodge for 10 years at least, until we've seen it settle down, work regularly, and be firmly established. And that has not yet happened in Georgia. So although there are two actually competing Grand Lodges there, we don't yet have that problem. But then there's also the state of Georgia in the United States of America. And there again is a very interesting situation. We might talk a little bit more about this later, because there's a Grand Lodge there called the Grand Lodge of the State of Georgia. Every United States state has its own Grand Lodge. But there's also something there called a Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Georgia. And we've just heard from them that they'd like to be recognized, which anyway, you might talk about that a little bit later. I think I've said more than that.
We'll talk more about stateside Freemasonry a little bit later on. By the way, this is absolutely fantastic, Paul. Absolutely brilliant. I'm hanging off your every word here, and I'm just having a look at the time. We've got now 25 minutes left, so we've got a lot to get through. So what I thought we could do is go to our chat screen And John Dale's asked you an interesting question. He says, did you manage to visit any lodges in Bermuda on your travels? Freemasonry is alive and well. We have 5 UGLE lodges, 3 Scottish, 4 Irish lodges in 21 square miles. That's a really good question.
Well, I'm very glad he asked that question, because earlier on it occurs to me that many members on this call won't be aware that I describe myself as the Grand Chancellor. So I'm responsible for relations with the 224 lodges that we do recognize. I don't look after our districts.
Oh.
So United Grand Lodge of England lodges that are abroad in our districts, or indeed individual lodges. In some places in Australia, there's just an individual lodge without an attachment. I'm not responsible for those, and Bermuda is such a place. As it happens, although I visited Bermuda, I was at the naval base right at the southern end of the island, and I didn't actually get round to visiting a lodge there. So that's one of the visits where I haven't attended. However, a very good friend of mine, who actually now works in, would you believe, Liechtenstein, has reasons to go to Bermuda quite often, and he did visit a lodge the other day and said it was absolutely superb. So I'm aware that I could, but no, I haven't personally done that.
John, fantastic question. Remember, brethren, ladies and gentlemen, questions to the chat screen. That's where you'll find the MCF appeal link as well, if you'd like to support what's happening in Ukraine in the sense of the appeal that we're doing at the moment. Now, I must ask you, Grand Chancellor, COVID, it hasn't gone away. How has this affected your role? Because you've been in position for, is it 2 years?
Yes. Well, the very first thing that happened was that actually, having got my letter saying, right, we'd like to make you Grand Chancellor, and me replying saying, oh, what a terrifying prospect, but eventually agreeing and accepting. On the day that there should have been an installation, the most worshipful program master phoned me up and virtually put a chain around my neck. So we didn't actually have a proper installation. But anyway, having done that, of course, we couldn't travel and we couldn't do anything. But then what a wonderful thing we're doing now, Zoom. The effect was that I was able to get to meet people all over the world through this means, and possibly it drove me to meet rather more people than I would have met by this sort of method than otherwise. And so I attended virtually a number of installation meetings. I attended, for example, what a wonderful name it is, the Grand Lodge of South Australia and Northern Territories.
Well, that sounds ace, doesn't it?
Marvelous to have a name that spans 2 sides of a continent like that. Anyway, I attended his installation virtually. And although that is never a substitute for meeting people face to face, because real trust and empathy and understanding only comes from face to face meetings, it's a jolly good start. And you must realize from what I said earlier that I knew absolutely nothing about any of this before I took over as Grand Chancellor. So it's been a very fast learning curve. And I think possibly the COVID meant that was a bit easier than might otherwise have been the case, particularly now that I know what the pace of work is like, now that I've settled down to it. And I should point out that I'm in a part-time volunteer role.
Yes, and I bet it doesn't feel like that, that is for sure. Now, Paul, we hear a lot about, we hear the term, don't we, regular Freemasonry, irregular Freemasonry. Perhaps you could give us the difference between the two for those who are unaware.
Yes, I know. Well, look, the problem here is that recognition and regularity are 2 very different things. So we would never consider recognition of a lodge that is irregular, but there are quite a lot of lodges that we probably work perfectly regularly that we don't recognize. And if I started to explain that for very long, you'd think I was talking about angels on pinheads or something very, very baroque like that, because it all gets very complicated. But I do commend, brethren, that the basic principles to recognition, which are at the beginning of this book here, which is the yearbook, they lay it out very, very clearly, and they lay it out what it is that we must see in a Grand Lodge before we consider it for recognition. And they're the things that we recognize in our own lodges, because we want to be comfortable that we can visit them and they can visit us. I could talk a bit here about irregular lodges if you'd like me to,
go for
Brody,
it, Paul.
because there's lots of them around. I mean, if I can give you two examples, I think you know, so it's no good. This is not a live chat, but I quite often go into a group of Masons and say, right, chaps, how many Grand Lodges are there in France? And people will say, 3, and I'll say up. They'll say 25, and I'll say up. And they'll say 100, and I'll say up. And the answer is that there are 137 things that call themselves Grand Lodges in France alone. And of course, we only recognize one of those, the Grand Lodge Nationale Française. In general, we only recognize one Grand Lodge in any given territory, and there are many exceptions to that, which we might go into. In the United States of America, the same applies. They have a lot of what they call clandestine lodges. And these are things that call themselves Freemasonry, but have some other important principle. Casting your mind back, well, I can hear all the young people saying, yes, you remember the 18th century. But going back to the 18th century, this was a time when Freemasonry was one of the main drivers. Well, it certainly was a common thread of the interests of many of the people that led the rebellion of the North American colonies and then the French Revolution. But many of those revolutionaries were atheists or became atheists and started adopting an entirely different approach to a humanistic attitude to Freemasonry. And that's one of the sources of many Grand Lodges that we don't recognize. But another one comes down to the little word ego. And that is that you have a Grand Lodge in country X, let's not specify it, and there's an election to become Grand Master, and one chap wins it, the other chap loses, and the chap that loses goes off and says, I would not work with him. And he goes off and he takes some friends with him and he forms a new Grand Lodge, and there's a split. And it takes ages to get back together again. We suffered it ourselves in the 18th century. That's why we're called the United Grand Lodge of England. We did eventually get back together. So I could continue at some length on that, but that's the basic of it, really.
No, thank you, Paul. I would love you to carry on talking about that, but we've got so many questions to get to. So let's probe a little bit more deeply. How does that relationship work when you have recognised sovereign Grand Lodges and districts under UGLE in the same locations? How does that side of it work?
Yes, it's the answer is generally without difficulty. The point here, brethren, is that in many parts of the British Empire, but also other countries as well, what happened is that after a time, the local lodges decided that they were too distant from the motherland for their interests to be looked after as well as they would have liked. And so they decided that it was time for them to have an independent Grand Lodge locally and remain in amity with the Grand Lodge of England, but to break away. When that happened, and the particular case I'm thinking of here is in India, where this took place in 1961, each individual lodge was given an opportunity to decide, well, do you want to join the new Grand Lodge of India, or would you like to remain attached to England? And we'd set up districts for those lodges. And I don't know whether at the time the people that did that expected those districts to survive as long as they have, not only to survive, but to prosper and to grow. And in India now, there is a Grand Lodge of India, there are English districts, and there are still Scottish and Irish districts working very happily together. Whereas, for example, in the district that we refer to as Eastern Archipelago, one of our largest districts now, I think it may be the largest now, that covers both the territory of Malaysia and Singapore, and there is no Grand Lodge of Malaysia there. There's a procedure laid down in the Book of Constitutions as to how a group of lodges would go about forming into a Grand Lodge if they wanted to break away. There's a requirement to have what a majority they need to do so, but they have not done so in that place, and they have done others. So there are many parts of the world. For example, this last weekend, we have for many years had a district in South America, Southern Division, basically Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay, and a district South America, Northern Division, basically Brazil. But this last weekend, we added another country to the list because the Grand Lodge of Paraguay, the symbolic Grand Lodge of Paraguay, has transferred one of its lodges in the capital, Asuncion, to the Grand Lodge of England. And last weekend, our district Grand Master from South America, Southern Division, attended the installation of the new Grand Master there. And while he was there, he visited our new Grand Lodge of England lodge in Asuncion in Paraguay.
Wow, wow.
And obviously we only do that because the locals are happy to have us. We have to agree to share the territory. I haven't used the term sharing the territory before because this is the one that can lead to angels on pinheads sorts of discussions. But basically, two lodges, Grand Lodges, need to agree to share the territory.
Brilliant. Thank you for explaining that, Paul. Lots of people enjoying our talk, so thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen and brethren, for expressing that. Now, this is an interesting one, actually, coming closer to home. There was recently now please tell me, Paul, if I'm pronouncing this correctly, a tripartite dinner. Is that right? Have I got the pronunciation correct here? A tripartite dinner with UGLE.
Now, come on, Brady. You can't call it a tripartite dinner. You understand the dinner was an entirely incidental part. This is a tripartite meeting. This was the pro-Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England and the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Ireland and the Grand Master Mason of Scotland meeting for their annual exchange of matters of common interest, meetings that's also attended by the Grand Secretaries of those organizations, because of course we are the three oldest Grand Lodges in terms of the ones we recognize. We started out in 1717, but then we had Ireland and Scotland for very shortly afterwards. And we work very closely. When I say we work closely, we are entirely sovereign and separate. But we often find that we have a similar view, and sometimes we find we don't have a similar view, but then we talk about it. And yes, there was a dinner, but you probably saw a photograph that was put out about that, an entirely incidental activity, I assure you. But you know, tripartite, this can be quite complicated in different parts of the world. There are some places in the world where, after independence and decision to set up a local Grand Lodge, the Irish, Scottish, and English constitutions came together and set up one Grand Lodge only. Tasmania is an example of that. Whereas other places, more recently, for example, in Malta, the Sovereign Grand Lodge of Malta there, when it formed, took with it the Irish constitutional lodges and some of the English ones, but some of the English lodges and one of the Scottish lodges decided to remain. So now in Malta, you've got England, England, Malta, and Scotland. And in South Africa, there's actually 5 Grand Lodges, because there's the Grand Lodge of South Africa, England, Scotland, and Ireland, and the Grand East of the Netherlands. Indeed, in June, there will be a celebration taking place in Cape Town to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the first lodge to be founded in South Africa, which still exists. Indeed, they still use a temple that was built, I think, in 1801. Wonderful building there in Cape Town, and the Grand Lodge of England will be represented at that 250th anniversary celebration. So coming back to tripartite, one thing I think people don't realize, or perhaps a lot of foreigners find quite surprising. By foreigners, I mean people from the other side of the channel. I don't now, is that the Grand Lodge of Scotland has never held a meeting in England, and
Oh,
England would never be allowed to hold a meeting within Scotland. There is an interesting exception to that, which is that the Grand Lodge of Ireland has 2 travelling warrants given to British Army regiments that meet wherever that regiment happens to be. And both of those regiments currently happen to be in England and therefore meet in England with Grand Lodge of Ireland warrants. But that's an unusual exception.
oh, thank you, Paul. Are we talking
Since I've gone on too long again, Brody.
No,
Sorry.
not at all. Are we talking Lodge of Glitter and Star, by the way? Is that what we're talking about?
That's one of them, yes.
Yes, in the distinguished province of Worcestershire, one of those. Brethren, thank you ever so much indeed for your questions. Let's go back to one of those. Daniel Yang has been touched on. He says, how to identify recognised Grand Lodges when travelling to foreign countries? Because I guess what he's asking there is if one were to travel abroad and would like to visit a Grand Lodge or attend a lodge meeting, what's the best thing you would advise somebody to do?
Well, you need to contact your local provincial Grand Secretary. Best to do it through your own secretary and your lodge secretary, and the provincial Grand Secretary will then know what advice to give. In the case of London, actually, it's a bit simpler than that because the Metropolitan Grand Secretary's office has a lot of experience, a lot of information, and they actually do quite a lot of responses on behalf of the Chancellery. Because what will happen next is the Provincial Grand Secretary will contact my secretary, Kerry Bias, as I referred to earlier, or if she's on leave, David Roberts-Jones, and they will provide the advice as to how to get in touch with regular Freemasonry if there is regular Freemasonry in that country, and if there are any points to watch when there. Things not to talk about, Grand Lodges not to attend. There are some, for example, countries in which there are 2 Grand Lodges that use exactly the same name for one another. I'll actually give the example here of Romania, where there's a National Grand Lodge of Romania, but at the moment there's a bit of a split, and there's a group of individuals who've broken away who are calling themselves the National Grand Lodge of Romania. Well, now you wouldn't know that if you just arrived in the country and turned up somewhere, you might go to the wrong one. So that's a very important precursor step. And then the rules are quite clear that you aren't actually allowed to make detailed arrangements for your visit until you're actually in the country that you arrive at. And that's something that's agreed across the world.
Sage advice, Paul. Thank you very much indeed. And Daniel, thank you for letting us have that question on the chat screen. So many wonderful questions coming in. And I thought we could talk about this actually, Paul. Very important year next year as we commemorate 1723 constitutions. And I know you're quite keen to talk about that. A big year ahead.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned it. Yes, I am, because I think this is quite often incorrectly referred to as the Anderson constitutions, by the way, which only refers to the how it was published initially. The better known as the English constitutions, which was, I suppose, the document which set out for the first time how we should be organised. And you must remember that at the time this was done in 1723, Europe had just emerged from a century of the most ghastly religious wars. Most recently, we'd had a major war against Louis XIV and the French. The French themselves were in the process of doing the pogrom's the wrong word. They were persecuting the Protestant population of the country, and we in England saw the hard-won constitutional gains, the liberty of Parliament, the liberty of the individual. There was the perception that this was threatened by a restoration of a Jacobite Stuart monarchy from abroad. Only in 1715 there'd been battles on British soil over it. It was to happen again in 1745. So that the setting down of those articles which talk about the liberty of the individual and the way that things should be organised, committee structure, separation of powers, we could go on. And indeed, do read about this, and there's a lot could be said here. This was arguably was certainly a very significant part of the development of Enlightenment thinking in this country and countries associated with our influence. And from that, it was used as the basis for the constitution of quite a lot of the individual states in the United States of America, and then the basis of the United States Constitution, and then the basis for many of the more sensible people at the beginning of the French Revolution. And it has had a very great influence upon the development of Western society. In 1723, this will be celebrated not only here in England, where we're having a special meeting of Grand Lodge on the 31st of January, and a conference up in Peterhouse in Cambridge in September of that year on this topic, but also there will be major events in Paris and in Washington, D.C., two other places where they look to this as a very, very significant event. So a lot to look forward to there, and a lot of interesting articles to read. Some of you will have read Rick Berman's excellent article in the latest magazine that went out this month, and there'll be more to follow on that.
Paul, thank you for the update. We needed to talk about that. A very big year ahead of us. Quite a few people actually wanted to know, out of all the lodges and different countries that you visited during your Masonic career, what have been some of the most wonderful differences that you've seen that you're allowed to talk about?
Differences? No, I think I'm not going to say that, because I think it's the things that are the same that are more important. So I'm not going to answer that question. Sorry. Well, I mean, I could scratch my. I hadn't actually prepared any thoughts of what were some of the most dramatic things. But I'd look. The thing that's much more significant is how similar things are. That people have the same attitudes, and you can go into a lodge in Valparaiso or Santiago in Chile and find yourself amongst people who have your same ethos, your same way of looking at the world. And they may have very different practices with respect to the dinner or what they had before and after the meeting, for example. That tends to vary a lot, but not otherwise. I mean, there are lots of variations, of course there are, in the ritual, because there are so many different ritual traditions. And on this call, there will be very many people that know a great deal more about that than I do. And I suppose, casting my back to a young officer, going into a place like going to a lodge meeting in Singapore and discovering that nearly everybody was Chinese, with quite a lot of Indian origin people and some Malays, and then we went off to the most fantastic end-course banquet afterwards. But it was the same as our lodges. It's the things that are the same that are much more important than the differences.
That is.
I'm sorry, that's a bad answer, but that's
not at all. Actually, you've raised something interesting. We say it all the time, don't we? It doesn't matter where you go. We've all been through the same experience. There might be subtle differences, lodge to lodge, province to province, country to country, but we're all in it together, and all Freemasons together. Paul, it's time for me to wrap things up. But before I do, I just wanted to say, what are you most looking forward to in your role as Grand Chancellor in the future?
Again, I'm not going to answer that directly, Brady, because I think, although getting to know more about the job and getting better at it is probably, and having a chance to visit more, because so far I haven't had a chance to visit many Grand Lodges, and of course it's very interesting to do so. But I will just cast my mind back to an early talk I had with the Grand Lodge of Cuba. Many people on this call may not even know that there is a Grand Lodge in Cuba, and I can assure you it's one of the most thriving ones to which I spoke. They've got more than 30,000 members. They have thrived under communist rule. It's one of the places where communists and Roman Catholics can meet together. There's a lodge on nearly every street corner, and a very young, but when I say young Grand Lodge, I mean they've got a lot of young members. They're very involved in social programs, and that was a real cheering up call to do that. Well, that was my goodness, they had good spirits. So I think getting to know more people like that is probably the answer to your question.
Oh, wonderful, Paul! I thoroughly enjoyed talking to you. I can't begin to tell you how much. 45 minutes was never going to be enough. Most importantly, forget about me. Back to that. Have you enjoyed your experience?
You kept me from my beer. That's the first thing I've been able to have.
That is a very good sign. Thank you very much indeed, Paul, for making our Solomon Live this evening so special. And I should add, ladies and gentlemen and brethren, our next Solomon Live will be, put this in your diary, Tuesday the 19th of April, and will feature Sir David Wootton, Assistant Grand Master and past Lord Mayor of London, where we'll get an insight into what it's like to be an Assistant Grand Master and, of course, what he learned from his time being the Lord Mayor of London. So that's 7:30, Tuesday, the 19th of April. And if you haven't done so already, make sure that you register for Solomon, solomon.ugle.org.uk, full of fantastic content and, of course, your daily advancement in Masonic knowledge. Until then, enjoy the rest of your evening, and we shall see you very, very soon. Take care. Good night.